Welcome to the Mark Divine Show. This podcast is about more than just listening. It's about sparking action and inspiration while transforming yourself, your community, and the world at large. Each episode is designed to help you grow as a leader, break through personal barriers, and make lasting impact. Together, you and your host will explore topics like mental toughness, emotional resilience, purpose, and evolving consciousness, while embracing challenges and facing this fast-changing world. Our guests on the Mark Divine Show are exceptional individuals who offer wisdom from diverse fields, whether it's science, philosophy, leadership, human performance, or psychedelic research. Join us today as we dare to think bigger, live bolder, and unlock the common potential within everyone. Here's your host, Mark Divine.
Hi, this is Mark Divine, host of the Mark Divine Show. Welcome back. Thanks for joining me today. Super stoked to have you here, where I love to address anything related to integrated development, vertical development, growth, consciousness, awareness, mental toughness, physical strength and courage, and spiritual development, amongst other things, like peak performance and meditation. And sometimes I have guests who are experts and doing uncommon things in these areas, and other times, like today, I will just share my thoughts and beliefs and stories around a particular subject. I've been doing a deep dive on what I call the 5 mountains of development, which are part of my Unbeatable Mind training, and which I address in depth in my latest book, Uncommon, which is available wherever books are sold, especially Amazon. So check it out. Uncommon, simple principles for an extraordinary life. The 5 mountains are the developmental pathways or capacities that we all have as humans. Your physicality, that we call that the physical mountain. Your mental mountain, which is your mind, developing your mind for whole mind thinking. Emotional mountain, of course, we know what emotions are. We're going to talk about that here in part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1, and I recommend you do listen to part 1, which will be, I imagine, the week before this episode. And so that is developing emotional awareness and learning how to do the work of emotional awareness and emotional healing from trauma, as well as eradicating fear and regret. So we operate at only the positive levels of acceptance and forgiveness and compassion, equanimity, those types of things. Open-hearted awareness. Then there's the intuition mountain. We'll get into that next in the future, where we'll talk about what intuitions are, how do we pay attention to them, and why it's so useful for us to develop intuitive and creative capacities so we have more capacity to operate in this exponential world that we're in. And the final mountain is the spiritual mountain, really coming back to ourselves as a spiritual being, recognizing that we are already whole and perfect as we are right now, in that immediacy of the moment, everything is just fine, right? And we're going to have a little bit of discussion about that from its impact on the emotional mountain today. So again, thanks for joining me. Emotional Mountain Part 2, and let's get right at it. So in Part 1, I talked about what emotions are, and we had an extensive discussion about the varieties of experience of emotion, both gross and physical emotions, as well as sensations and interpretations, as well as subtle emotions around the chakra systems. We talk about the difference between affect and sensations. An affect would be like a long-term chronic emotion like apathy, or a chronic or a systemic acute emotion can be more like a flinch response or the experience of rage that suddenly overwhelms you. And all of these are patterns that get stored in your body. And so to recognize an emotion, then we have to recognize that there is some root to it. And that root is generally going to be from an event that we interpret. And if it's not a positive event, then and we're not mature enough, especially if we're pre-verbal, meaning young, super young, before 3 or 4 years old, then you're going to take some sort of strategy. You're going to apply or deploy some sort of strategy to protect yourself from this seemingly dangerous event. And it could be just the withholding of love, or maybe anger between your parents or toward you. or even some sort of experience of physical violence, like getting dropped or something like that. And you're going to interpret that with that pre-verbal mind, pre-logical mind, in a way that's going to protect you, but it's also going to carve out like an area and store that area, store the energy in that area, and we call that a part or a trauma pattern that gets kind of stuck in your energy field, in your body as well. Later on, as an adult, these show up as sensations or some sort of affect, such as, like I said, a mood. And it can even have a combination of both. So you could have the sensations, the physiology of anxiety or depression, along with some affect that makes you feel not whole, right? And so that could be some mood such as shame-based self-worth or something like that. So there's a lot of discussion, a lot of preamble that is in part one of this episode. And I think we just kind of touched the surface. So in this episode, I want to really go a little bit deeper into cognitive processes in the interpretive aspect of emotions. You might have heard the term default mode network. So default mode network is essentially the conditioned response patterning that your brain has. Part of it is affective and emotional, right? Because your brain includes the limbic system and the amygdala regions of your brain, right and left hemisphere, which will then parse the information that's flowing into your mind for danger or opportunity. And it'll trigger a fear-based physiological response. We'll call that the sympathetic nervous system. Will trigger that, and then those all the hormones associated with the sympathetic nervous system, such as adrenaline, epinephrine, start flowing through your body, which then activate certain aspects of your default mode network to interpret the experience in a negative or fear-based way, and it creates what I call a behavioral loop or a fear loop. And so a fear loop could have a triggering event, such as something that happens outside of you. It could be major, like COVID, that triggered a lot of people into this massive fear loop where they just couldn't get out of it. And it led to a lot of mental distress and, a lot of breakdowns, actually, to be fair, and immune system responses. And a lot of people got sick just from the fear. Or it could be something internal, right? It could be one of those trauma patterns, part of your, what I call the background of obviousness, which is not obvious to you, but obvious to everyone else because it's hidden from view, or what the psychology profession would call part of your shadow. It's there. You can't see it, but other people can see it because it's reflected off of you. And so you might have a shadow element, which is one of those trauma parts that you split off from yourself that could get triggered or activated. It can get activated through movement. And so there's a positive aspect to movement, like somatic movement can help release or expose some of these triggers. For instance, with yoga, a lot of hip openers will release energy that's stored in that region. A lot of emotional energy tends to get stored in the hips for some reason. And so you'll find people with great emotional releases through the movement of yoga or somatic work such as rolfing or massages, etc., or dance can be quite liberating and helpful for emotional work because of the energy gets stuck in the muscles and the tissues of your body. Default mode network then is exactly what I said. It's your default. It's your go-to. The trigger happens either externally or internally. The trigger then, it does one of two things. It either activates a sensation, a bodily sensation, which then your mind interprets as something like it could activate some anxiety or fear. And then the mind will look at that and say, oh, that fear is bad or that anxiety is bad because of A, B, or C. And that A, B, or C is usually the same A, B, or C that you interpreted the last time this happened, which then reinforces that pattern, meaning it literally strengthens that synaptical response and reinforces that pattern, greases the groove of that pattern, which turns it into kind of a belief system. And that loop, you may add even more energy to it by obsessively running it through your mind over a period of hours, days, weeks, and sometimes even longer, right? So this is what builds up a lot of long-term regrets, long-term fears, long-term experiences of inadequacy, shame, and guilt, because you just replay these things over and over from the triggering event. And it could be external and internal. External example of that would be someone actually saying something that you feel is shameful. And so in that scenario, you interpret first, and the interpretation then triggers the sensation. So it could be either way. Trigger the sensation that then creates the interpretation, which then gets reinforced, or event could be triggering, usually an external event will trigger an interpretation, and then the sensation will follow, and then the belief system will be reinforced. And these loops, this play over and over and over. You've heard me say on the Mental Mountain podcast that you tend to have 60 to 100,000 thoughts per day. It's not like a single thought. It's a loop. It's a thought stream that you have. And a packet of thought streams around a particular topic we could call a belief system or a mental model. Now, when you begin to do the mental mountain work of mindfulness, you become aware of these thought streams and patterns. And that helps us immeasurably do the emotional mountain work, because very few thought streams are devoid of emotionality, right? And very few emotional patterns are devoid of some sort of interpretive thought stream. They really go hand in glove, right? This is why the work of mental development and emotional development really are ultimately the same, right? They're ultimately the same, but we kind of separate them into two separate things. But you'll find that a lot of really competent people in the field of psychology and therapy are starting to combine the two. They're starting to combine mental work, such as meditation and mindfulness, and cognitive
behavioral therapy.
Well, cognitive behavioral therapy, yeah, that's right. That's kind of combining cognition with emotionality or behavior. Thanks, Kath. And also somatic work. So combining the body, the mind, and emotions into one integrated practice really is the holy grail. And we're going to address that a little bit later, some of the practices and tools that we can use. So how do we deal with this default mode network? If you're saying, that's great, Mark, I experience what you're experiencing. I see that I have these triggers and these patterns that, I just go off. And a great example would be like the road rage, right? So, you get triggered by someone cutting you off in traffic. That triggers a belief, thought pattern, which triggers a rage, some sort of physical sensation. That rage then kind of runs its course with reinforced with more thought patterns about what a jerk that person was and how, you're going to now want to run him off the road. And this can be quite destructive. I remember hearing a story about a woman who got cut off by a motorcyclist, and it spun her out into a rage loop, and she couldn't get it out of her head, and she kept reinforcing and feeding that fear to where she literally had to take revenge against this guy, and she chased him down in her car. And of course, I'm sure unintentionally, although it probably looked intentional, she ran into him and ended his life. And she's now in jail. So how's that for out of control emotions? We don't want to be like that. We've got to get control. So how do we get control? First, we got to become aware of these loops. And that's where mindfulness comes in. I made a comment that mindfulness is as much about emotional awareness as it is mental processing, because of the close correlation or relationship between mental and emotional processes. So mindfulness is really when you develop the capacity to just be present and observe your thoughts. This is best done as a meditative practice, which is why mindfulness is often taught as meditation. Mindfulness doesn't have to be looked at as meditation, with air quotes. Generally speaking, people think of meditation as hard, as something that you do in a seated position when nobody's around and you're nice and quiet. That's true. You can do that. That's certainly part of the practice. But some of the preconditions for effective mindfulness is to be able to concentrate and to clear your mind of clutter, so that you open up the space to be able to observe those thoughts, and to train your contextual awareness or right hemispheric thinking, which is the seat of observational awareness where you can observe the content that is formed in your left brain linear mind. So mindfulness is very helpful for that. But ultimately, mindfulness really is just moment to moment observing, right? And we used to use the term PBTA in the SEALs, pausing, breathing, and breathing nostrily, diaphragmatically, which calms you down, activates the arousal control process, and gives you the capacity to separate yourself from your thinking and to think about your thinking more clearly. So pause, breathe, then think. Think about your thinking as mindfulness. And mindfulness means you move away and you disengage from yourself as the thinker, and you observe the thinker. You observe the thinking. And when you can do that, when you can develop that capacity to observe your thinking, then you can start to observe the quality of the content of your thinking. And that is where you begin to see these loops playing over and over and over. Another great way to experience or to become aware of these loops is through relational work, right? So if you have a significant other or a spouse or a best friend, to be like, hey, what do you notice in me? Where do I get triggered? What are some of the things you notice that are my repetitive behaviors? This is really valuable because, again, we're inside the bottle and we can't read the label of our own thoughts and behaviors oftentimes, but certainly those closest to us can read it because they're experiencing the effects of your thoughts, words, and actions. And so relational work is a great way to learn about these loops, and of course then through therapeutic processes, which we'll address in a moment. So we want to develop the capacity to observe these loops and then name them, right? So you can have a loop that activates some sort of fear-based response that keeps on recurring around like fear of heights or fear of not measuring up or, those things. So you name it, right? And then because you've named it, now you've kind of objectified it. You've taken that thing which was hidden from view, i.e. it was part of your background of obvious. Now you've made it part of your foreground of obviousness, where it's now obvious to you. And because it's part of your foreground, now you can, by bringing attention to it, you can begin to move the energy and just be okay with it without naming it and reinforcing it and adding energy to it, which then makes it stronger. And what I call this process, just for simple terms, is starving fear and feeding courage. Are you ready to embrace the impossible with your four-wheel travel adventures? If so, I'd like to introduce you to the Defender, which is an icon of adventure reimagined for a new generation of explorers. With unstoppable capability, this Land Rover vehicle is engineered to meet challenges head-on, on and off the road. The Defender family, which includes the 90, the 110, and 130 models, exude confidence and are fully equipped for 21st century adventures. Imagine conquering rough terrain with ease thanks to 3D surround cameras and clear sight ground view, letting you anticipate obstacles before they become a problem. And their next generation Pivy Pro infotainment system and intuitive driver displays are customizable to your journey, helping you make more of your adventure. So whether you've got grand ambitions or you're exploring uncharted territory, the Defender's legendary capability and modern design make it the perfect companion, especially for those of you who refuse to stay put where you're at. It's more than just a vehicle. It's a statement of exploration and durability. So if you're ready to start your next adventure and you want a four-wheel friend that's up for the task, then you've got to explore the full Defender lineup. Go to LandRoverUSA.com. Again, LandRoverUSA.com. Check it out there and design your own icon of adventure today. Are you ready to revolutionize your hiring process? Don't search for employees. Match with Indeed. Indeed's driven by the search for better. And when it comes to hiring, Indeed is your ultimate solution. Why Indeed? Well, Indeed's the premier matching and hiring platform, boasting over 350 million global monthly visitors. Their advanced matching engine helps you find top quality candidates fast, eliminating the need for tedious searching. Streamline your hiring process with Indeed. Say goodbye to busy work. Indeed offers seamless scheduling, screening, and messaging features, allowing you to connect with candidates faster than ever before. An impressive 93% of employers agree that Indeed delivers the highest quality matches
compared to other job sites. We've got over 140 million qualifications and preferences analyzed daily, with a matching engine that continuously learns and improves, tailoring results to your specific needs. So join the ranks of more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that trust Indeed to hire greater talent quickly. In fact, during this short ad, approximately 23 hires were made on Indeed globally. There's an exciting opportunity for you. Get a $75 sponsored job credit to boost your job visibility. Simply visit Indeed.com/Divine to claim this special offer and support the Mark Divine Show. Remember, when it comes to hiring, don't search. Match instead with Indeed. Visit Indeed.com, INDEED.com/Divine, DIVINE, right now. Terms and conditions do apply. You need to hire? Then you need Indeed.
So you've heard the story probably of the two wolves, the Native American story, or the native story of two wolves. So the native elder is telling this story to the kids that there's these two wolves and that they're always in a fight. They're in a fight for your attention. And one of the kids says, well, which one wins? And the old man says, well, the one that you feed the most. So if you're constantly feeding the fear loops, then they're getting stronger. So it's like akin to feeding that wolf nice juicy steaks, that fear wolf. So instead of feeding the fear wolf, what we want to do is feed the courage wolf. And the courage wolf resides in your heart. And so it literally means to open your heart and to feed that with feelings and attestations or affirmations or positive internal dialogue around things like acceptance and forgiveness and positive language around that. Like, you're okay. All this is good. Feeling good, looking good. Ought to be in Hollywood was one of my positive affirmations. It was kind of fun, but ultimately over time, it led to a positive mindset, and it led me away from, or I starved some fear-based processing and mental languaging that I had, or internal dialogue I had, which was placed there by living in my family, which had a lot of negative languaging. So we want to learn to starve fear by not paying attention to it, by turning away from the fear loops, by identifying them, objectifying them, and then saying no to them. And one of the processes I developed for Unbeatable Mind, which is very helpful for this feeding the courage wolf and starving fear, is called the WIRM process, WIRM. So when you develop the capacity to observe your thinking, then you can witness when, that's the W, you can witness when one of these fear loops is triggered. And instead of feeding that fear loop by jumping on the bandwagon and riding it and adding energy to it, you intercept it. That's the I, W-I. You witness it, then you intercept it and you say no. And it's like cutting that loop with a pair of scissors or a hatchet. And that loop gets severed because you intend, your willpower says, no, we're not going to have this thought. I'm not going to fly off into rage. I'm not going to repeat this pattern. No, no, no. And then you redirect your attention to something that the courage wolf, feed that courage wolf a juicy steak. And so that redirection would be to that positive mantra. And every one of you needs to develop a positive mantra for times like this. And for me, it was, I've got this, easy day, piece of cake, hoo-yah, hey, or something along those lines. I am worthy, right? I am powerful. I am creative, whatever it is. I am, you insert your own language. You have a positive mantra. So you witness the fear loop. You intercept it by saying some sort of powerful statement that says, no, I'm not going to do this. You can zap it with a mental lightning bolt, redirect your energy to feed the courage wolf, and then you maintain that positive energy with your mantra. That we call that the WIRM process. That is a very, very powerful attentional control and interdiction process so that you can stop reinforcing default mode network, negative fear-based thinking and emotional patterns.
So interdicting, like, don't do that, don't do that, don't say that, don't say that, that's still feeding the fear wolf, correct?
Yeah, this is a great point, Catherine. When you interdict or intercept and redirect, you want to use positive language because you could actually reinforce it by saying, for instance, I think what you're referring to is like, okay, you observe the fear loop, and then instead of saying, not now, I'm better than this, I'm going to redirect to something positive. You say, you idiot, there you go again, stupid head, having that same negative thought. What's wrong with you? Right? And so you might slow it down, you might stop it, but you're actually adding negative energy to it. Right?
Yeah.
So it's very important that you have a positive.
Like for me, there's times when I'm very emotionally triggered that I've been like, don't say that, don't say that, don't say that. And then I say it anyways.
Right. Then you say it anyways. It's better to be like, I'm not going to go down this path. I am worthy.
I'm worthy. I'm strong.
I'm strong and I believe this instead of.
And baking a batch of delicious cookies is a better option.
That's right. I love that. That's a redirect.
That's a redirect.
What's your mantra, Catherine?
Mine is that I am a powerful goddess in service of love and light.
That's awesome. Powerful goddess in service of love and light. That's a great mantra. So this is how we practice courage. You know, courage, I love Aristotle's idea that courage is kind of a balance between, on the one hand, brashness or excessive boldness, and on the other hand, timidity. So courage is a practice, right? Because it's not a one thing. It's more like a scale, and everyone's gonna have a different kind of a relationship with courage based upon their experience, based upon their aptitude, based upon their what it is that they are feeling less than courageous about. So fear-based thoughts can be triggered by crises, like existential issues, or can be triggered by irrational beliefs, like, for instance, the discussion of the road rage incident, right? That's completely irrational, but it triggers a pretty powerful response. So we want to be aware where, like I said, where we get triggered, and we want to be able to then practice courage by feeding the courage wolf cognitively, with our internal dialogue, but also practicing courage by facing what we fear, identifying it and facing it, and then learning about it, right? Making friends with it a little bit. So great example of this, and then I'll tell a little story about real versus irrational fear. But like real fear for us as a Navy SEAL came in our first few parachute jumps, right? Because it's just not normal to want to hurl yourself out of an airplane that's flying 400 miles an hour at 20,000 or 30,000 feet. There's not a whole lot of people who just wake up and say, hey, I'm going to go throw myself out of an airplane. But we had to do that because it's part of our job. Of course, we did it with a parachute, thankfully. And I'm really grateful that they gave us parachutes, because otherwise that would have been a one-way trip. And so, but it's still, every time the first time we jumped out of the airplane, there was a lot of fear. And any SEAL who said they didn't experience that fear is full of shit. There's a fear because there's an existential crisis. There's an existential threat to your life. Like you are literally committing suicide until that parachute opens, and then you feel this tremendous release, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to survive another day. That is rational fear. Irrational fear would be to have 1,000 jumps and to be terrified out of your mind every single time you jump out of the airplane. Like, you got to deal with that there. That's some other trauma-based trigger there that is causing that irrational fear, because you've got a lot of evidence that your procedures, your skills, and the protocols and the reserve chute are there for you. Doesn't mean you will not experience still some anxiety. I know many SEALs still feel a little anxiety, but they've learned to transmute that sensation into commitment and determination, or even excitement. So that's a powerful way of transmuting your emotions by changing your interpretation of the sensation that you have into something that's powerful and positive. And we do that through training. It's part of about practicing courage as training, moving closer and facing that which you fear, and practicing, incrementally those things that make you scared, and you just get better and more competent. And as you get more competent, you get more confident. And as you get more confident, you get more courageous. Now, I remember I was climbing once in the Adirondacks with a good friend of mine, Wynn Calder. I tell this story in the book Uncommon, Simple Principles for an Extraordinary Life, which a lot of this training is based on. And I remember we came across this kind of canyon and this ledge that we had to cross because the trail was impassable on one side, and we saw that it was passable on the other side, and yet this ledge, was about 60 feet up, and it had a little bit of maybe a 2-inch foothold. But the handholds, we had to it was like rock climbing, but we were scooting sideways. So Win was probably an advanced rock climber, and I was more of a beginner to intermediate. So he scurried across, no problem. It's about 15 feet across. And then it was my turn. So I started going across, and I remember feeling my heart rate, elevate. There was definitely a little bit of anxiety, fear, but I was breathing, and I was like, okay, I can do this. And so I scooted across, and I was nearing the other edge. And one thing for those of you who know climbing, you always have to have 3 points of contact, meaning 2 footholds in one hand at least while you reach for the next handhold, and then 2 footholds in one hand, right? Or 2 hands in 1 foot, but you always want to have 3 points of contact. Well, I got over there and suddenly I lost both handholds, right? What I was trying to grip on, tiny little knobs, and my fingers popped off from both of them. And so suddenly I was only left with my feet, and I felt my center of gravity begin to shift away from the wall. And what does that mean? That means I was falling. And I experienced like an intense wave of existential fear because I was going to die. There was no way for me to grab onto anything, right? There was nothing for me to grab onto to bring myself back into balance on that wall. And as that fear, that very rational fear washed over me, I suddenly felt my right hand being pushed back to the wall. And Win had just simply reached over with his palm and just pushed my hand, because he saw what was happening, pushed my hand back to the wall, and it brought me back into balance, and I was able to scoot over and get off the ledge. He saved my life, frankly, with a very simple move. And if he hadn't been paying attention, then I wouldn't be here. So that's rational fear. Now, immediately after that, because I had some basic skills from my practice in martial arts and Navy SEAL training, I was able to get control and to redirect my mind to positive things and carry on and turn it into a positive learning experience, one that I can, really enjoy telling the story about. But then there's irrational fear, as I mentioned earlier. Irrational fear is most of what happens with negative emotions, right? The irrationality comes from the trauma strategy that was created usually in pre-verbal stage of development, as I mentioned earlier. And so these irrational fears tend to show up, right, as anger or rage or anxiety, and shame-based patterns or guilt-based patterns of behavior. So it's really important that you do the work to expose these patterns. And we do the work through, as I mentioned, through mindfulness, but we also want to do the work through therapeutic processes. So I want to talk about some of the core aspects of what I call doing the work of the emotional mountain. There's 3 elements of work, right? One, the first and most obvious where people start is around content. So we've talked a lot about the content of your cognitive as well as affective lives, right? So what we mean by that is the sensations and the interpretations around your emotional life. Most of us are really obsessed with the content. And by content, I mean the actual verbiage you use with your internal or expressed dialogue and how you interpret these sensations and bodily feelings that you have, or the behaviors. And so there's a therapeutic processes. Catherine mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy. This works on the content of your life. And most talk therapy also works on content, where you rehash stories and patterns, and you talk about them and you try to reinterpret them and come up with better dialogue or better associations around the events of our life that weren't optimal, right? Suboptimal events. That would lead to behavioral change, or we can do the opposite with cognitive behavior therapy. We can work on the behavior first, which then begins to change your cognition around what caused, what was driving that behavior to begin with. So content work is important, but it's not the end all and be all. The second is process. So I've talked a lot about process work, because when we talk about a fear loop or a behavioral loop, it's really a process. As I mentioned, there's a triggering event that triggers a either an affect or an emotion or a sensation, and then an interpretation, or it triggers an interpretation and then followed by some sort of affect or sensation, and then you pile on, right? It's like hopping on that horse and riding and galloping it off in this looping direction and ending up right back where you were before, but now you've added more energy and emotions to that loop, so pretty much guaranteeing that it's going to happen again. And by the way, I'll take one moment here to address why it happens again, because all of this is happening in the present moment, but it's based upon past-based memories. And so you're reactivating past memories. You're feeding those memories in the present moment with more energy and more interpretations, which then get stored back into that memory bank, but with more energy, which is guaranteeing that energy is going to show up again in some future present moment when it gets triggered. And this is how people end up repeating their past over and over and over again, guaranteeing their future looks exactly like their past, because they keep contaminating the present moment with those past-based, fear-based emotions. So we want to be clear that in order to do this work, we've got to eradicate those negative patterns, negative emotions, and de-energize them. That's what I mean by starving fear and feeding courage. Feeding courage means creating more positive memories, more positive emotions, so that when they get activated, they don't disrupt you, and that you can add different positive experiences and expectations and attitudes, which then projected in the future create a different future, a more positive one that's propelling you in a direction you want to go. So process is different than content, because you're really working on the underlying reason and rationale that you created that trauma-based process strategy to begin with, and you're eradicating the loop, you're intercepting those loops, you're exposing those patterns to the light of awareness, and you're letting the energy flow, and you're able to just sit with it and make friends with it. We'll call that a handshake. And you don't let those negative patterns disrupt you anymore. And you can actually turn them into positive motivators, positive lessons. And you do this through forgiveness and insight, and move on so that your past doesn't continue to contaminate your future. So we talked about content work, and we talked about within content work, you have talk therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, amongst others. Process work, you're going to have the work of like depth psychology, shadow work, parts work of Richard Schwartz and others, and trauma recovery processes. And they work at a process level. The third level of work, I'll just call the ground work. And this is found mostly in Eastern traditions, such as yoga or Buddhism. Buddhism is a psychological mental training program, and yoga is a psychological mental training program. Originally they were not religions. Yoga is never a religion and still isn't to this day, but Buddhism spun off into a religion. But at its root, the teachings of the Buddha were about developing your mind to experience greater and greater openness, diffusion of the ego to the experience of selflessness or no selfness, and the experience of awakened awareness, right? And that awakened awareness is the ground of being. And in that ground of being, that experience of the ground, you are already free. You are already a perfected human being, because every human being has that experience, has that ground of being. And that ground of being is source energy, it's spirit, right? It's consciousness. It's the background of who you are and why you're alive. It is aliveness itself. It is life force. And so this third level, generally you have to work through both content and process to get around and away from the mental clogs. And then you begin to experience more of that open awareness of the ground work and the sense of overall contentment. And so the effective energy and emotions shift from the negative territory to the very positive, and you begin to experience the things like equanimity and contentment and happiness that is not associated with the release of pain or the accretion of some pleasure, right? When we're in our linear mind and we're in just content and processing, generally we swing wildly between avoiding pain and trying to experience pleasure. And pleasure really is just simply the temporary release of pain. So everyone's experiencing some form of pain or temporary release from pain. Whereas when we get further along in our emotional mountain work and we begin to open up to the ground of our being, then the experience of happiness that is not related to this wild swing between the riverbanks of pain and pleasure begins to reveal itself. So we want everyone to get there to where they experience this state of the ground of your being as being already free from pain and pleasure, already free from fear and regrets, and everything is going to be okay. And that in that moment of present moment awareness, you have this sense of immediacy, and in that immediate moment, regardless of what's going on in your body, you can just be aware of it and let it be experienced, and know that regardless, in spite of that, everything is still okay.
Look, folks, I'm 61 years old, but I put in physical workouts and a daily routine that would break a lot of guys half my age. And I plan to do that going strong for decades to come because, why not? Well, if you want a lifestyle that defies your age, a great place to start is by adding Qualia Senolytic to your routine. Qualia Senolytic does something that science didn't know was possible until 2015. You see, as we get older, our bodies accumulate something called senescent cells, also named zombie cells, because they're old cells that no longer do their job, but they hang around, wasting energy and nutrition. And the more we age, the more we accumulate these senescent zombie cells. So many aging challenges are related to this. Your workout recovery, reduced energy, joint pain and discomfort, and simply feeling old. But in 2015, Scripps and Mayo Clinics discovered there's natural plant-derived ingredients that can help your bodies eliminate those senescent cells. That's where Qualia Senolytic comes in, combining 9 of those game-changing ingredients into a single supplement. The difference that Qualia Senolytic has made for my own aging process has been incredible. I'm living a lifestyle someone half my age by keeping my senescent cells to a minimum so my energy and vitality can stay through the roof. If you want to feel your prime way longer than you thought possible, you got to try Qualia Senolytic. And you can get up to 50% off right now at qualialife.com/divine15. And the code divine15 at checkout will get you an extra 15% off. Qualia backs their products by a 100-day money-back guarantee, so you've got no risk. Again, check it out. Qualia Senolytics will help you age better. Trust me. Go to qualialife.com, qualialife.com/divine15. That's DIVINE15. And again, use that code divine15 for an extra 15% off to help you stay in your prime for years to come.
So let me talk about some psychologists, kind of groundbreaking psychologists and different kind of vectors on the work. And there's a lot more here, but these are some of the key ones that I like. Of course, everyone's heard of Sigmund Freud. Freud's work really was all about your relationship with your parents and also how that created subconscious kind of programs based upon sexual energy. He was insightful in breaking or discussing 3 type of levels of awareness or consciousness. He called it the ego, which is everyday awareness, the id, which is subconscious kind of awareness, hidden from view, and the superconscious or superego, which is really more like what you call your higher self, willpower, the part of you that knows what's right, even though your ego might do the opposite. So Freud's work was groundbreaking, although limited in some senses. His student, Carl Jung, broke from Freud. He learned a lot from him, but he broke from him and started to look also at that psychological processes could be inherent in cultures as well as collective consciousness, and he called those archetypes. And so this is really interesting because you can begin to look at your life or the arc of your life and see that you actually have some archetypes. I talk about this a lot in my training when we try to help clients discover their overarching purpose. We say, look at your purpose in archetypal terms, not in doing terms like a career, like, oh, my purpose is to be a doctor. No, your purpose is to be a healer. And one way you can heal is by being a medical doctor or medical professional. So archetypal energy, is you're going to be along the lines of like warrior, healer, joker, those, teacher, scholar, those types of things. And you can even come up with your own, but if you study Carl Jung or just do a quick chat GPT, you'll see the core archetypes that he talked about. Other archetypal models are the Enneagram. That's also a really powerful one. You can do, you can take a test for the Enneagram online, and it'll point to what your core archetypes are, and then how they relate to other sub-archetypes. It's very powerful work, and that was all kind of groundbreaking work with Carl Jung. He also did a lot of work with dreams, and so Freud kind of ignored dreams, and Carl Jung said, no, dreams are interesting and important. It's just, you have 3 states of awareness. You have conscious waking state, then you have dream state, and then you have sleep, right, which is undifferentiated. The mental processing is kind of like at rest, and so you're just experiencing aliveness. And the more aware you get, you become aware of that aliveness in deep sleep as well. And you can also become aware of your dreaming. We call that lucid dreaming. And most people aren't aware they're dreaming while they're dreaming. And so they try to, it's important to, like, if you have a powerful dream that is generally symbolic in nature, there's some message there or something that your subconsciousness is trying to work out or reveal to you. It's important, helpful to sometimes just write down what the dream was and look for patterns and look for like the feeling of what the dream is trying to tell you. Not the content, but the overall arc of the dream could be revealing something important for you to, so pay attention to that.
And that's dream interpretation. Lucid dreaming is when you're conscious that you're dreaming and you start to be able to shift what's happening in the dream.
Right, you can take control of the dream because you're aware of it while you're dreaming. Yeah. Interpretive, right, Catherine's right. So just journaling about your dream is interpretation, and there's a lot of good resources out there to help you kind of interpret what certain dreams are, because a lot of people, again, these are like Carl Jung said, that even dreams can be archetypal or from the collective consciousness. So if you're having a dream repeatedly, there's a really good chance that other people have had it or are having it, right? Catherine and I talked the other day about one common one, which is the feeling or experience of being pinned down in a dream. I've had that experience a number of times. I've had a lot of dreams which are related to childhood trauma where this is hilarious, where I'm doing something, but like I'm missing my boots or I'm missing my pants, or I'm naked, or and it's embarrassing. I'm like, what the heck? How come I can't, I'm not on top of my game here. Like there's something missing. And that's a shame-based or trauma-based, not enough kind of pattern that's trying to reveal something to me. Of course, what it's revealing is that how silly that is, and you are enough, right? You are okay and you are worthy. So dreams, that was Carl Jung. Really, really important, right? Even just to do a quick summary of his work, I think you'd find it very useful.
Yeah, he believed that really the dreamer was the only one that could interpret their dreams. Even though the Jungian psychologists trained in dream analysis and they were trained in a way that was to ask questions and try to help the individual decipher the symbols and the signs within the dreams. And so he was very much like, you can look up, those dream dictionaries and everything, and sometimes if it feels true to you, possible, but ultimately why you're having this dream somewhere in your like psyche, your unconscious, conscious.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Positive psychology has been very helpful. Martin Seligman was kind of the grandfather of that, but the others prior to him addressed positive psychology. I think Maslow, right? The hierarchy of needs, he talked about it. And, Maslow is really incomplete. Most people have an incomplete understanding of the hierarchy of needs, right? The highest they think was self-actualization, but in his later life, he said there was actually a level above self-actualization that was self-transcendence, which I think was spot on. And so self-transcendence really gets into kind of positive affect and the importance of, really kind of feeding that positive mindset. Martin Seligman's work, I think has been misinterpreted in some regions because a lot of people said, well, what about negative emotions? Negative emotions can be instructive, and we got to deal with our negative emotions. Otherwise, you could just bypass them and get into like toxic positivity. And just like everything's happy, I call it putting the happy, glad wrapper on it. Well, he didn't say you weren't going to deal with negative emotions. Negative emotions are really important. We got to process them. We got to move away from them. We got to starve them. And but we also simultaneously want to grease the groove of positive emotions and positive belief systems and abundance and optimism and those things. And so it's a both and, right? We don't ignore the negative side. We actually work on it and try to eradicate those fears and those regrets and those shame-based thinking in all the ways that we've been addressing, while simultaneously working on positive psychological processes and replacing fear loops with courage loops.
Would there be like I'm feeling grateful that I'm angry right now because there's an opportunity to develop awareness? Could that live in positive psychology?
100%. I think that's a great example of a bridge, right? So Dr. David Hawkins says that courage is the bridge between negative emotions of, fear, jealousy, rage, everything that's below, he calls in his level of consciousness, scale of consciousness below 200. And so an example of feeding the courage wolf would be like, oh, I'm experiencing this anger right now. Remember, I'm going to interdict it, right? I'm grateful for this opportunity to overcome this or to work on this. I'm going to do this with courage, and I'm going to approach the healing with acceptance and forgiveness. And so you see anger can, just like obsessing about the anger could keep you trapped in that level of anger. But courage, which is positive, and facing that anger with a positive mindset, courageous mindset, and then moving really quickly into acceptance, like, oh, that is just anger. That's not me. That's one of the keys. I didn't mention it earlier, but again, this idea of divorcing yourself from the thought as I am not that thought. So if the thought and emotional energy is one of anger, most people who've not done the work are going to say, I am angry. Yeah. But when you do the work and you get into a courage and acceptance, you can look at that anger and say, oh, anger is being experienced here.
Right, I'm feeling angry.
But I am not. I am accepting of that. Anger is an experience that is being experienced in this body. What is the root of that anger? Oh, wow, there's something really positive I can learn from this, because what I see is that anger is a part, something I parted off when I was a child and my father hit me over the head, right?
Right, and fear, and so fear lives underneath that for survival.
That's right.
And so anger is pointing towards fear.
Right. Ultimately, you're right, Catherine. Like anything, most of those energies that are expressive, like anger, rage, jealousy, shame, they're all just pointers to some underlying sense of not feeling secure, secure as a kid.
In my experience, being angry about something as of late, I notice that it's actually a protective energy. So that underneath my anger is me wanting to protect myself from harm.
Right.
So there's fear that I'm going to be harmed. Right. So there's a false story running that something outside of me can harm me. And on a very unconscious, it does come from a very younger self that couldn't take care of the environment.
That's right.
Whereas as an adult, that underlying feeling is not true.
Right. That becomes one of those irrational fears.
It's an irrational fear. And so I can say, oh, I'm grateful that I'm angry because I actually can recognize that I care about myself and I want to make good choices and be in an environment.
And here's a really good point. In a lot of cases, the anger will go away or whatever that expressed energy will go away, but sometimes it won't. Right? Sometimes it won't, but you can shake hands with it.
Yeah.
You can make friends with it. You can be like, oh, that's interesting. There it is again. I am not that. And that's pointing towards something that is really valuable for me. And so then you can bring compassion. That's where compassion comes in.
Dalai Lama talks about that. Yeah. The Dalai Lama says that a lot. Like or Thich Nhat Hanh too. Like, you say, oh, hello, my friend.
That's right.
And then it's a bowing to, a recognizing.
It's very much of a Tibetan Buddhist practice to shake hands or make friends with your emotion. I think it's beautiful. I love that. There's a couple more, and then we'll have to wrap up. More modern psychological processings come from Richard Schwartz, done great work on parts versus the whole.
No bad parts.
No Bad Parts is the book, so I highly recommend you take a look at his work. Really groundbreaking. Terry Real, another phenomenal current kind of therapist, has done work about relational therapy, and this is really important. It helped me open my mind. We talk a lot about the importance of working with a team and how powerful teams are for emotional development in my Unbeatable Mind training and SEALFIT training. And so I totally got this right away when I read Terry's book called Us, U.S. And what he's really saying here is that for emotional maturity, especially in relationship, like with the significant others, you've got to move away from a mentality, which has been really honed and refined in our Western culture of staunch individualism and the pioneer or the warrior as an individual, and move to an us kind of mindset in recognizing that none of what we really do in life is done alone. You may think it is, but even when it comes to emotional work, like really it's oftentimes our relationship with others where emotional patterns show up because they get triggered, right? And he makes a point that you tend to like invite your significant others into your life to basically be your partners for growth and healing, right? So Terry Real's work is phenomenal. His book Us is a must read. And then the last one, Bruce Tift, he's done a phenomenal job. His book Already Free, talking about integration of Western psychotherapy with kind of Eastern processes or Eastern ideas of being already free. Like I said, being that ground of okayness, of ground of everything's fine. You are that, right? You are whole already. You just have this ego that's kind of like overlaid that and has obscured that from your view. And so combining the doing work of therapeutic processes, Western psychotherapy, and a lot of the work we talked about here with this idea that you can get through meditation and non-dual awareness and sitting in nature and those types of things, that, clarifying the ego, reframing all those things, opening up your aperture and experiencing the groundedness and the ground of your being as already awesome, already free. So those are some of the my favorite psychologists and academics. I encourage you to check them out if you're fascinated with this subject, as I am. I hope that you can get fascinated with this idea of emotional mountain work, because it really is unbelievably rich and it's important because our emotions drive most of our actions, behaviors. You got to do the physical and the mental work to be able to do this well. So that's why these first 3 mountains of the 5 mountains are crucial. So do the work, right? It's really important. If you want to live a whole, full, complete life, thriving, aligned with your purpose, and in relationship with others, growing, learning, sharing, and positive, optimistic, abundant, and forward focused, then you got to do the emotional work. Thank you for your attention. Please share the Mark Divine Show with your friends and family if you find this valuable. And come back next time, where we're going to address the 4th of the 5 mountains, called the Intuitional Mountain. Thanks again. This is Mark Divine, your host. Till next time, get emotional. Hoo-yah. Bye now.
Thank you for joining us on the Mark Divine Show. We hope this podcast has enriched your life as well as encouraged you to think from new perspectives and make actionable change. You can find all the resources from this episode on the website markdivine.com, along with the video version on the YouTube channel. Just search Mark Divine. You can also connect with Mark Divine directly on Twitter X, Instagram, Facebook, or you can also reach out if you want to share ideas, bring up topics you'd like to hear Mark discuss, or any guest suggestions via his LinkedIn page, Mark Divine. A big thanks to our amazing team at Jet Studios, bringing this podcast to you every week. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the Divine Inspiration newsletter. You can go to markdivine.com and subscribe there. Check out Mark's new performance-focused supplements at sealfitsupplements.com. If you are a new or regular listener to the Mark Divine Show, we would be so grateful if you could rate and review the show. It helps with visibility, and it also gets us out there to more people that are wanting to be positive change agents in this world. Remember, you have the power to create change you want to see. So let's all strive for a better world as trailblazers and warriors of positive change. Stay inspired, stay curious, and be uncommon. Thank you.